And joining us from Caracas now, we welcome Dany Shaw, who's a political analyst and has been observing the elections this Sunday. Dany, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Tell us about what you've seen this Sunday.
What we've seen here in Caracas is an environment of peace, of security. It's too early to tell in many of the 24 states whether the opposition has won or Chavismo has won. I was able to visit with international election observers, including election observers from the European Union, polling stations in Petare, polling stations in Miranda. We saw widespread participation. We heard the usual political bickering that one would hear on election day between this and that party. But it seemed like a lot of enthusiasm, despite all of the difficulties the Venezuelan people have faced with this unrelenting, cruel, unilateral blockade. And that was another sentiment. Some people felt like no matter how the turnout was today, the bigger war, the war for true sovereignty and liberation from this hegemonic reality of U.S. control was going to continue on Monday regardless.
Election process that has had broad public participation in terms of the participation of opposition parties that in the past sought to boycott elections and undermine election process. Do you think that given this broader participation in this case, there could be some more leverage in terms of convincing the United States to maybe try a different strategy with Venezuela?
That's not a prediction that I'd be confident making. It does seem, though, that versus the boycotting strategy, which would have guaranteed Zulia and Amazonia as the frontier states with Colombia, Chavista control, it's too early to make prognostications, but if Chavismo loses some of those states, certainly that gives the U.S. and Colombia free hand to continue to use Colombia as a proxy state with the 9 U.S. military bases there, the free deployment of U.S. troops across Colombia onto the border to try to stir up whatever type of disorder and chaos. So I do have a sense that out of the 24 states, those are some of the key states, and they could come down to the wire. They could go to the opposition as they have. Historically, Maracaibo, the second capital of Venezuela, has been historically a right-wing stronghold. So it appears tomorrow that could be one result potentially.
Dany, as you say, they're very important, the results in those border states. And we've seen that this Sunday, actually, the Ecuadorian president and the Colombian president were meeting. Do you think that's some kind of coincidence that they happen to be meeting on the same day as elections in Venezuela?
Well, that's one of the key roles of the Duques, the Bolsonaros, the Lassos, unions of the European Union, and of course, U.S. imperialism. I actually saw, or we saw a lot of the election observers from the European Union, and for the most part, they didn't want to offer any comment. They saw what many of us saw, but it's as if they had already cast their judgment in terms of the results. I think no matter what the results, the United States is not going to change its strategy, because the strategy is to strangle the Bolivarian revolution. The Bolivarian revolution is still going to have the executive and many of the mayorships and governorships. So I don't expect that to change. Also in Chile, we have to look at the entire regional context. Every electoral rivalry right now is really coming down to this central question, whether it's Peru or Chile or Honduras next weekend. Will you be part of the anti-imperialist Bolivarian pink wave, the second pink wave? Or will your country do the bidding of U.S. imperialism? So that's certainly been the function of these lackeys.
You say we have to look at other countries and their electoral process. We saw Nicaragua, and we've seen the attacks on Nicaragua ever since its elections were held. And today we have Chile. And from what the results are showing, we have two completely different candidates who are likely to go face-to-face in the second round. We have, on the one hand, the leftist, Boric, and then we have a fascist candidate on the other hand. What do you think that could result in Chile could mean for the wider region in terms of, for example, Venezuela and the process happening there, and how Venezuela is historically one of the countries leading the sort of pink tide in Latin America?
There's a lot of red baiting from Ecuador to Peru to Chile. They want to strike fear into the electorate that Chile or Peru is going to become another Venezuela, quote unquote. And they try to equate Venezuela with chaos and hunger and desperation without ever contextualizing the all-out, hybrid, multifaceted, total war on the Venezuelan people. So certainly the class struggle is playing out in the summits of power right now. We saw the divisions between Cristina Kirchner in Argentina, Kirchner and Alberto Fernandez, the president. We've seen the right-wing Congress attacking any of Pedro Castillo's appointments in Peru. In Chile today, thus far, is disappointing, but there were another two candidates who received over 10% of the vote. So in the second round of that election in December, it can still swing either way. We've seen a massive movement in Chile for a constituyente, for a people's assembly, a massive movement to change the Pinochet-era constitution. So I think anything can happen in Chile, even though right now they've sidelined the revolutionary candidate. It's the social democratic candidate. And right now it seems that many Chileans didn't participate today. Perhaps many of the youth were very disappointed that they had these two ruling class options and not the outsider, radical anti-imperialist candidate that they thought they were going to have.
Dany, do you think that we could see, in terms of domestically in Venezuela, with more possible posts held by opposition parties, a kind of change in terms of the domestic balance of forces, and how could that possibly affect how Venezuela overcomes the obstacles of the US blockade and sanctions policy?
The opposition's function is to try to facilitate the US's re-entry into Venezuela, the recolonization of Venezuela. They'll use underhanded tactics, they'll use overt tactics. Certainly today has been the triumph of democracy, people's democracy, workers' democracy. But the opposition, the Juan Guaidos, the Leopoldo Lopez's, they're going to continue to try to undermine any project of continental unity. Any positions that they win or that they don't win, they're going to try everything to continue to subvert from within, and of course in tandem with US imperialism that has isolated Venezuela, trying to cut off Venezuela from its own resources like Citgo, the bank that the gold that the Bank of England has stolen, being cut off from international credit in the banking institutions is a very big deal. They've undermined the Venezuelan currency. So this is still, in some ways, it's a Bolivarian country, but it's a polarized country. And you feel that geographically, just like in New York City, when you go from the Upper East Side into Harlem or the Upper West Side into Washington Heights, there's still a sense of segregation, of class stratification that reigns across Venezuela because, as the Venezuelan leadership says, this is a revolution that's still building and developing, and it's a dialectical process with steps backwards in order to take many steps forward.
What can you tell us about what you've seen in the past few days when you've been in Venezuela in terms of how people are getting by day to day with the sanctions and how they actually do impact on people's daily lives?
The sanctions impact the everyday people in a very cruel way, to take up people's currency and reduce it to rubble, to deprive people of everyday things that we would take for granted in the United States, in the West. And then it's the ideological component. It's the ideological war to turn around and say, well, that's all the fault of Nicolas Maduro, and to just blame the people's government. We had a meeting yesterday with Nicolas Maduro where he laid out the trajectory of the Bolivarian revolution, 29 free democratic elections in 22 years. The problem, of course, is that from the perspective of U.S. imperialism, the wrong people are winning in Bolivia, in Venezuela, in Nicaragua, of course, in Cuba, and that's what they will never accept. But the fact that the PSUV and the Venezuelan people can invite revolutionaries and anti-imperialists from around the world to be a part of this ongoing revolution, and the contributions that the Venezuelans have made to social processes and social movements and revolutions and revolutionary struggle elsewhere. This is an internationalist people. This is an anti-imperialist people. I think every poor person in the world, every oppressed person in the world, every anti-imperialist in the world has an incredible debt to the Venezuelan people.
Dany, depending on the results, possibly, but what do you think we can see in terms of the reaction at the regional level to the results of this Sunday's elections?
Well, that's very predictable, Katrina, unfortunately. We know the opposition is not going to win all 24 states and hundreds and thousands of other local positions. So even if Chavismo were to win one seat or just 100 seats, and it'll win much more, the European Union has sent their representatives here, or their stooges. They've already renewed sanctions against Venezuela. If we begin to read CNN and the Washington Post before the results have even been announced, they're going to do everything to try to discredit this process here. And that's the informational war. That's the communicational war. Show us in the past 22 years when the Washington Post, the New York Times, CNN, Fox, the full gamut of mainstream media has ever uttered one positive word about the Bolivarian revolution. So the die is cast from the perspective of empire. They're going to do everything to discredit everything that this brave, valiant, united people has worked for. So it's very predictable what will be on the front page of the Financial Times in London tomorrow, in the Los Angeles Times, in the Miami Herald. It's going to be more aggression that's unleashed on Venezuela, a renewing of sanctions. They've continued this aggressive tactic that's completely not worked, of supporting a dual power, of inventing from thin air this Juan Guaido presidency. No one recognizes Juan Guaido across Venezuela, but they need a Juan Guaido. They need a substitute proxy government. How else can they siphon off the billions and billions of dollars of wealth from the Venezuelan people into their very own bank accounts and coffers?
Dany, joining us live from Caracas, where you're observing the electoral process. Thank you so much for offering your insight and for explaining to us what you've been seeing there on the ground. Thank you.